You know what's strange? Some of the sharpest people you'll ever meet aren't sharp because they studied harder or because they were born with some rare intellectual advantage. They're sharp because their brain learned somewhere along the way to notice everything. Not just the obvious things, the things underneath. The flicker in someone's expression that lasts a fraction of a second, the shift in tone that nobody else registers, the gap between what a person says and what their body is actually communicating. And from the outside, this looks like a gift. It looks like emotional intelligence, like deep perception, like wisdom. But from the inside, it often feels like something very different. It feels like a system that won't power down, a mind that is always scanning, always processing, always reaching for meaning in places where most people see nothing at all. And that's the psychological tension at the center of what we're exploring today. What happens when awareness, the very thing we're told to cultivate, becomes so constant and so deep that it starts to work against the person carrying it? To understand where this kind of awareness comes from, you have to look at two very different developmental pathways. The first is biological. Psychologists use the term sensory processing sensitivity to describe individuals whose nervous systems are wired from birth to take in more environmental data than average. These are the people researcher Elaine Aron identified as highly sensitive persons. Their brains don't filter the world the same way. Sounds are louder. Emotions are heavier. Social atmospheres carry a texture that most people never consciously register. For them, walking into a room isn't just arriving somewhere, it's absorbing everything that room contains. The second pathway is experiential, and this is where things get psychologically more complex. A significant number of people who develop extreme awareness do so as a direct response to an early environment that demanded it. Neuroscience describes this as hypervigilance, a state in which the brain's threat detection system, centered around the amygdala, becomes chronically activated due to repeated exposure to unpredictable or emotionally volatile conditions. Picture a child who grows up learning to read the weight of a footstep coming down the hallway, who learns the difference between a cabinet door being closed normally and one being shut with a tension that says something just went wrong, who figures out, without anyone teaching them, exactly when to walk into a room and when to stay invisible. That child didn't choose to become hyper-aware. Their nervous system made the decision for them, because in that environment, noticing everything was the difference between safety and chaos. And over time, that survival mechanism doesn't just fade, it deepens. It becomes structural. It becomes the lens through which that person processes every room, every conversation, every relationship for the rest of their life. And by the time they reach adulthood, most of them don't even recognize it as something unusual. They just think this is how everyone experiences the world. It isn't. So what does this kind of awareness actually look like in daily life? Let's start with the most energy-consuming pattern, and that's living in a state of continuous interpretation. For most people, a conversation is just a conversation. Words come in, responses go out, and the exchange ends when the topic changes. But for someone who is overly aware, every interaction carries layers. They don't just hear what someone says, they hear how they say it. They notice what they didn't say, and they register the micro-pause between the question and the answer. Their brain is running a parallel process beneath every social exchange, scanning for incongruence, for emotional subtext, for anything that doesn't quite line up. Take something as simple as a message from a manager that says, "Let's catch up later today." For most people, that's a calendar item. For the overly aware person, it's a puzzle that their brain immediately starts working on. Was the phrasing different from usual? Was there something colder about the tone? Did something happen earlier this week that might explain why this meeting was requested? They're not choosing to overthink it. Their mind is doing what it was built to do, extracting every possible layer of meaning from the available data. Part of this connects to the default mode network, the brain system responsible for self-referential thought and internal narration. In most people, this network activates during rest or daydreaming. But in people with heightened awareness, research suggests it tends to remain more active even during engagement, meaning their brain is simultaneously participating in the moment and commenting on it from the inside. Half of them is present, the other half is taking notes. And the result is a kind of cognitive exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical activity. They can sit at a desk for 8 hours and feel completely drained. The work itself wasn't difficult, but their brain just spent 8 hours interpreting every email, every glance from a colleague, every silence in the meeting that lasted half a second too long. But that analytical lens doesn't only point outward, it turns inward too. And this is where things become genuinely difficult. Psychologists use the term metacognition to describe the ability to observe and evaluate your own thinking. Everyone has this capacity to some degree, but in people who are overly aware, it operates at a level that becomes almost punishing. They don't simply experience an emotion, they monitor it, question it, and then judge themselves for having it. Sadness shows up, and instead of just feeling it, the mind immediately intervenes. Why am I sad right now? Is this rational? I shouldn't feel this way given everything I have. So why does this heaviness keep coming back? And even positive emotions get scrutinized. They laugh at something, genuinely laugh, and within seconds, a quiet internal voice asks whether the laugh was too loud, whether it came across as forced, whether anyone in the room read it differently than it was meant. This creates a strange kind of disconnection from their own experience. They're always one step removed from the moment, because part of their mind is hovering above it, evaluating. It's the psychological equivalent of trying to enjoy a dance while simultaneously watching yourself on a screen to correct your posture. The technique might be flawless, but the feeling of actually being lost in the music disappears entirely. And over time, that disconnection becomes its own kind of loneliness. Not loneliness from other people, but loneliness from yourself. From the version of you that could simply feel something without immediately asking whether the feeling was justified. Now here's something worth pausing on, because the patterns we've been describing don't exist in isolation. They feed into each other, and when they compound over time, they begin to reshape how a person experiences connection itself. People with this level of awareness often develop what psychologists describe as heightened theory of mind, an advanced ability to model other people's internal states. They can sense when someone's cheerfulness is a performance. They can feel the difference between a compliment that's genuine and one that's strategic. They pick up on motivations that the other person might not even be fully conscious of yet. And while this sounds like a remarkable social skill, and in many ways it is, it comes with a cost that's rarely discussed. It erodes a certain kind of relational simplicity. When you can see through the surface of almost every interaction, it becomes very hard to just take things at face value. A kind word from a coworker triggers a quiet background calculation. A friend's apology gets analyzed for sincerity before it's accepted. A new relationship carries the weight of pattern recognition from every previous one. This isn't cynicism. It's not distrust in any deliberate sense. It's a mind that has been trained to look deeper than most. And once that training is in place, it doesn't come with a switch you can flip off when you'd rather just enjoy something without interrogating it. The result is a quiet kind of grief. Not for anything specific, but for the ease that other people seem to have in simply believing what's in front of them. There's another dimension to this that deserves attention, and it's the way hyper-awareness interacts with empathy. For most people, empathy is something that activates in specific moments. When a friend shares bad news, when they witness suffering, when a situation clearly calls for emotional attunement. But for someone who is overly aware, empathy tends to operate more like a background frequency than a conscious choice. They walk into a room and absorb its emotional atmosphere before anyone speaks. They sit across from someone at lunch and feel a tension in that person's body that the person themselves hasn't consciously acknowledged yet. Neuroscience connects this to mirror neuron activity, systems in the brain that fire not only when we experience something ourselves, but when we observe it in others. In people with heightened awareness, this mirroring appears to function with greater sensitivity, meaning they don't just understand what someone else is feeling, they begin to physically carry it. A colleague's frustration becomes a tightness in their own shoulders. A partner's sadness settles into their chest and stays there long after the conversation ends. A stranger's anxiety on the train somehow gets absorbed into their nervous system without a single word being exchanged. And over time, this creates an invisible labor that rarely gets recognized. They become the person everyone gravitates toward, the one who always seems to understand, who always knows the right thing to say, who can hold space for difficult emotions without flinching. But what almost nobody thinks to ask is what happens to all of that emotional weight once the other person walks away. Because it doesn't leave with them. It sits in the body of the person who absorbed it. It accumulates quietly. And at the end of the day, the one who understands everyone else often has no one who understands the particular kind of tired they carry. Which brings us to something that psychology has only recently started exploring more carefully, the physical dimension of hyperawareness. Researchers use the term interoception to describe the brain's ability to sense and interpret internal bodily signals, things like heart rate, muscle tension, breathing rhythm, gut activity. This process is largely managed by the insular cortex, and in people with heightened awareness, interoceptive sensitivity tends to be significantly elevated. What this means in practical terms is that their body becomes another source of data that the brain is constantly monitoring and constantly misreading. A slight increase in heart rate after a cup of coffee doesn't just register as alertness. The brain flags it, cross-references it against past experiences of panic or danger, and sometimes launches a full anxiety response over something entirely benign. A tight feeling in the chest might be nothing more than tension from sitting in the same position for too long, but the overly aware brain reads it as evidence that something is seriously wrong. And this is where the experience becomes physically exhausting. Because the body starts producing stress hormones in response to the brain's interpretation, and those hormones create new sensations, which the brain then interprets as further evidence of threat, which produces more hormones, the cycle feeds itself. Nothing dangerous is actually happening. The monitoring system is simply so finely tuned that it treats ordinary physical noise as emergency data. And when all of these systems, the analytical mind, the emotional absorption, the physical vigilance, run simultaneously for long enough, something else begins to emerge. A deep, almost compulsive need to stay ahead of every possible outcome. Not control over other people, but control over the unpredictability of life itself. The logic is quiet, but very clear. If I can anticipate every scenario, I won't be blindsided by pain. If I can read every situation before it unfolds, nothing will surprise me. And so the mind begins constructing elaborate internal models of the future, running through possibilities, preparing emotional responses to events that haven't happened and may never happen. Behavioral psychologists recognize this pattern as anticipatory anxiety, and it's remarkably common in people whose awareness developed as a protective mechanism. They live in 10 different versions of next week, while barely inhabiting this afternoon. The cruelest part of this pattern is how invisible it is. From the outside, they look thoughtful, composed, maybe a little quiet. From the inside, they are running simulations at a pace that leaves almost no room for the present moment to simply exist as it is. So what does psychology actually suggest for someone living inside this kind of mind? Here's the honest answer. The goal isn't to become less aware. You can't unlearn perception, and you wouldn't want to. The real work, and this is what clinicians who specialize in this area consistently return to, is learning to change the relationship between awareness and response. Noticing something doesn't have to mean absorbing it. Seeing a pattern doesn't require solving it. Feeling the emotional temperature of a room doesn't obligate you to regulate it. Acceptance and commitment therapy offers a framework here that's worth understanding. It teaches a practice called diffusion, the ability to observe a thought or a perception without automatically merging with it. Instead of, my coworker seemed tense, so something must be wrong and I need to figure out what it is, the reframe becomes, I noticed tension, and that's information, not an instruction. It sounds simple. For a brain that has spent years treating every observation as a task that requires a response, it is anything but. But the research suggests it's effective. The awareness stays fully intact. What changes is that a small but critical pause opens up between seeing something and feeling responsible for it. And what that pause looks like in practice is quieter than you might expect. Say you're sitting at dinner with a friend, and you notice their energy shift halfway through a sentence. The old pattern would be instant. Your chest tightens, your brain starts building theories. Are they upset with you? Did you say something wrong? Is there something they're not telling you? And within seconds, you're no longer at dinner. You're inside your own head, constructing an entire emotional narrative from a single shift in someone's voice. The pause doesn't eliminate any of that. The perception still fires. You still notice the shift. But instead of the brain immediately assigning meaning and responsibility, there's a brief moment where you simply observe it. Something changed in their tone. That's what I noticed. That's all I know right now. And that fraction of space, that tiny gap between seeing and reacting, is where the exhaustion starts to loosen. The awareness is still there. What loosened is the compulsion to treat every observation as something that needed solving before the conversation was over. It sounds small. For a mind that has spent years running at full speed on every piece of emotional data it collects, it is one of the most difficult and most relieving things it can learn to do. Here's what all of this comes down to. Awareness, in its deepest form, is not a flaw. It is a particular kind of cognitive architecture, one that sees more, feels more, and processes more than most minds are built to handle. The people who carry it are often the ones others rely on most, the ones who sense what's wrong before it's spoken, who hold space for emotions that aren't theirs to carry, who navigate the world with a depth of perception that most people never develop. But that depth has a weight to it, and the most important thing a person with this kind of mind can learn is not how to see less, but how to hold what they see a little more loosely, to let an observation exist without turning it into an assignment, to feel a room without taking responsibility for it, to notice the tension in someone's voice and simply let it be theirs. Because a mind that sees everything deserves, at some point, the quiet permission to rest inside what it sees, without carrying all of it, without solving all of it, without letting it become one more thing the world asked them to hold. See you in the next one.